afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and joining us for a conversation on literary translation, which is a part of the Lit and Loose Festival of Language, Literature, and Art. And I just want to say that today's opening music featured a Chicago-based musician, Selene Townsend, and her composition, Lottie Blinks. I'm Rachel Galvin. I'm a poet, a scholar, translator at the University of Chicago, where I'm associate professor in the departments of English and comparative literature. I'm also the faculty lead for translation studies, which is a program that we've just launched as a collaboration between comparative literature and the creative writing program. I translate primarily from Spanish and French, and I'm happy to have been a participant at Lit and Loose Festival in the past, in a previous edition. Lit and Loose is proudly produced by Make Literary Productions, and this year's Chicago Festival, which is titled Remix, Respond, and Rebuild, kicked off last night, and it runs through October 9th as a series of virtual programs. Lit and Loose fosters the creation of new art through international collaboration and essential dialogues between residents of Mexico and the United States. And through conversations and the creation of new art, writers, artists, and musicians participating this fall are reconsidering past festival themes, while also responding to issues that are currently impacting the US and Mexico. So the full lineup of participants and the schedule of events are available at litloose.org. And we hope to see you there, which is here. And, and I'll mention some more about that at the end of our program. Today, I'm very, very happy to be I'm very delighted to be joined by four wonderful literary translators, Lucía Cornejo, Sophie Hughes, Gabriela Jauregui, and Olivia Lott. And before we get started, I'm just going to introduce them each very briefly. Lucía Cornejo is a writer and translator. She received a master's degree in translation with the project Good Times by Lucille Clifton, a celebration of life, and has been part of the Fundación para las Letras Mexicanas creative writing program. She's published in several national magazines in Mexico City, like Letras Libres, Este País, and Periódico de Poesía. Sophie Hughes is a literary translator of Spanish language writers such as Alia Trabuco Serán, Laia Jufresa, Rodrigo Haspun, and José Revueltas. She has been shortlisted twice for the International Booker Prize, most recently in 2020 for Fernanda Melchor's Hurricane Season, and Fernanda Melchor was a participant in Lit and Loose as well, and was longlisted in 2020 for her co-translation with Margaret Costa of Enrique Villamata's Mac and His Problem. Sophie currently works with the Stephen Spender Trust promoting translation in schools, and she's co-editor of an anthology titled Europa 28, Writing by Women on the Future of Europe, in association with Women Arts, Hay Festival, and Comma Press. Gabriela Jauregui is the author of Many Fiestas, Leash Seeks Lost Bitch. That is not easy to say. I think you did that on purpose. And Controlled Decay. She's also the editor and author of the Spanish language books Tsunami, published by Sexto Piso, and a short story collection, La Memoria de las Cosas, also at Sexto Piso. And she's the co-author of Taller de Taquimecanografía, which came out with Tumbona. She holds a PhD in comparative literature from USC, an MFA in creative writing from UC Riverside, and an MA in comparative literature from UC Irvine. She has been named one of the 39 best Latin American authors under 39 by the Hay Festival's Bogota 39 list. And she co-founded the Surplus Publishing Collective in Mexico. And I believe, Gabriela, that you're now teaching English at UNAM. Is that correct? Yeah. Super, congratulations. Olivia Lott is the translator of Lucia Estrada's Catabasis, which is due out in a matter of days from Eulalia Books, right? When's the publication date? It's coming up really soon.
Yeah, October 15th, so a week from Thursday.
Fantastic. Felicidades. It's a beautiful book. I've already read it. So spoiler, it's terrific. You've got to get a copy. She's also the translator of Soledad Rios' The Dirty Text, which was published 2 years ago by Cunning Editions. Olivia is ABD in Hispanic Studies at Washington University in St. Louis, where she's writing a dissertation on 1960s neo-avant-garde poetics in Latin America. So thank you to Olivia, Sophie, Lucia, and Gabriela for joining us today and taking the time to talk together about translation. And I just wanted to start off by saying, kind of taking a step back from the question of translation, say, why is it that we do this, this endeavor? Why is translation important? And why is it especially important right now in this year of 2020? So kind of an open-ended question to get us started. I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. Feel free to jump in.
Okay, since I get antsy when there's uncomfortable Zoom or virtual silences, I'll just go ahead and jump in. I think that translation's always been an essential task, aesthetic and political task. And of course, at moments like 2020, but also, in the recent years where sort of right-wing nationalism is sort of on the rise in several different parts of the world, translation is a way to sort of pierce through those like big virtual and real walls that keep getting erected left and right. So that's one important thing. I feel like that's something that's been happening forever, but that is especially relevant right now.
Mm-hmm. I could kind of respond from the other side. I completely agree with Gabby entirely. But then there's also that kind of personal response to the task at hand that is, for people who have the bug, is kind of life-saving. Anyone who has studied literature and who loves studying literature, who's interested in literature as a kind of, the highest concentrate of the world around us, in a way, kind of anyone who's interested in literature as that will understand that process of translation, which is really just like a process of close reading, right, where you're trying to hear significance, and the nuance just feels like such an antidote to the way in which we receive information and perceived knowledge, or kind of or maybe not so much knowledge anymore. We're all grasping for knowledge, and all we're getting is more data and more information. So for me, translation is a kind of antidote for that, certainly as a craft.
Yeah, I love
that idea.
Yeah, I would echo both of those ideas. And I think for me too, I just most fundamentally think about the importance of translation, or the urgency of translation, in the same way that I think about the importance or urgency of literature or cultural production. I think it's Ursula Le Guin's quote that resistance and change often begin in art, so often in our art, the art of words. And so thinking about literature and cultural production as a space where we begin to create new ideas and circulate them and expand our range of representations. And translation is something that's absolutely crucial in circulating that beyond the smaller circles that it would circulate otherwise.
Yeah, I also agree. I think that translation, sure, it's a process of close reading, but also it's like going into depth into someone else's work. So it requires a lot of taking care of language and paying attention, like really paying attention to someone else's work. And that, I think it's also a work of, empathy, ethical work, political work. And it requires like a more deep understanding of communication in a way, I think.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the Korean American poet translator Don Michei, who's been translating the work of Kim Hae-soon for some time, and she's said that for her, this isn't a joyfully cross-cultural kind of project, but it's specifically to remind us of the hell within and without the US empire. So for her, translation isn't an intellectual exercise or some kind of even cultural exchange, but it's rather a way to expose what a neo-colony is and what it does. And so she's talking about translation as a kind of decolonial exercise. And I think that that's something to discuss in terms of who we decide to translate, whose voices do we bring forward, right? What kind of activist element might be present in your translation choices, even on that level? So I'd be interested to hear specifically any projects that you've worked on that this might make you think of. Olivia, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Yeah. Well, Michei is a huge influence of mine. I love absolutely everything that she does, and the thing that I'm most inspired by is just how front and center her politics are in her approach to translation. The political aspects and the creative aspects cannot be separated in her work, and that's something that I also see in Catherine Hedin's translations or in a lot of Margaret Randall's work, and those are major points of departure for the way that I try and envision my role in a text that I'm translating. And so in my particular case, that has often led to choosing to work with writers who are underrepresented in English translation. That's primarily led me to Colombia. Colombia in poetry translation is one of the least represented Spanish-speaking countries. There are maximum 2 translations that have been published of full-length books of Colombian poets in the last 20 years. And Catabasis by Lucia Estrada, which will be out next week, will be the first time that a Colombian woman has had a full book-length English language translation in the United States, a Colombian woman poet. And so that's a major way that I think about it. And when we think about the particular case of Colombia in particular, mainstream representations of Colombia are incredibly exotifying. We maybe could funnel them into 2 kinds of main tracks. One, which is this sort of depoliticized version of magical realism once it reaches these global markets. And then another, which represents the armed conflict through this sort of US-friendly narrative of the war on drugs. And a lot of times these narratives become crossed. And so I think that translating poetry from Colombia, especially this book, which I think is really engaged with sort of the legacies or the continued overness of the armed conflict, can be a way to bring more complex representations of what's going on into English. And when we have not complex representations, oversimplified representations, that's also a way to not really have to grapple with US empire, which is so much of what Che is talking about.
Yeah.
Speaking of the kind of leading on from the exoticization of certain places that we translate from, I remember the year that I became a kind of full-time literary translator. It was the London Book Fair, which is a kind of important rights fair. It's kind of like the La Fille, maybe. And they had their country of like spotlight country, and it was Mexico. So for me, whose kind of links and ties and literary interests were already in Mexico, it was a really exciting moment, because obviously, publishers just wanted Mexico, right? They were just gobbling up anything to do with Mexico, because they had basically been exposed to it more by the nature of like it being a spotlight country. And so it was, a year in which that people were listening when you said, "Oh, I've got, this author that you might be interested in." People were saying, "Oh, right, okay, yeah," and listening. But it is also true that that year it was like kind of the amount of questions about what kind of narco lit have you got for me, like the same questions began to kind of rise to the surface as soon as you introduce writers. So that year I pitched and worked with Laia Jufresa's Bukumami, which is really a book that obviously it has lots of cultural references that are kind of rooted in Mexico, but it's also just a book about grief. You wouldn't like begin talking about that book saying that book's about grief, in the same way as that Brenda Navarro's book Casas Vacías is really just about motherhood, the 2 sides of motherhood. And so it's important to me, and when I was asked to be the co-editor for an issue of Words Without Borders on Mexico, like one of the first things I wanted to make sure is that we didn't throw Mexico into this pigeonhole, because then we're doing more damage than good, right? If you're just simply reinforcing the ideas that the press is feeding, especially to America, also to other Anglophone speaking countries, then you're not actually expressing the realities of Mexico. You're just doubling down on the idea of some false reality, no? Like, whereas literature is meant to kind of pluralize everything, make things more sticky and complicated and, ugly, not just in stereotypical ways, but kind of also just more down to earth and more about real life. And so it was really important to me it has continued to be important for me to find books where I find something really human about them, first and foremost.
To me, it's to add to what you both just said, it's also a matter of sort of, yes, countering these narratives that are oversimplifying, that then become, of course, sort of reinforcers of colonialism, but also just of basic racism, racist stereotypes. And so translation and choosing what to translate is also a work of hospitality, and sort of like this idea of radical hospitality in language, in words of others. Then again, I want to nuance that, because the languages I work in are colonial languages, right? So Spanish is a colonial language, English is a colonial language, French is a colonial language. So I sadly do not know, any, let's say, Native American, and I refer to America as the continent, not just the US, languages that I could be working with, because of processes precisely like racist and colonial processes of education in Mexico and abroad. So yeah, just to mention that within this, unlike the example when you're speaking of Korean specifically, our languages that we're working in are sort of already do have that. But then, like Olivia was saying, perhaps some of the literature that we are choosing to work with is sort of troubled and already has like these other languages that sort of sprout like little, mushrooms of resistance in there. And I was just thinking of Norbese Phillips' Zong, which is a very beautiful poetry book where West African languages sort of come in. It's a book about a slave ship that was sunk, and sort of it's in English, but then the sounds and everything she starts to work with these other sort of ghost-like languages, and then the act of translating that is, it's like this very wonderful, complex puzzle, and it gets sticky. And sticky, yes, in a generative, important way. Like, what are we doing? How do we not flatten this when we are translating it into, another language that has empire, sort of layers of empire within it, or gender things with Spanish and English, blah, blah, blah. So I'll just leave it at that for now. And so Lucia can tell us more.
In my experience, I think that, for example, when I chose to translate Lucille Clifton, I was kind of like searching for women who wrote about female genealogies and women in families, and women whose story has been erased from like collective official memory. And I was really preoccupied with that in my own writing. So for me, translating Clifton was like a way of finding a guidance that I didn't really had when I was just starting in my formative years as a literary student. So it was a process of, I don't know, I think of identification. I have a very emotional response to Clifton, and I let my emotions guide my choosing of that author. And I think it's also something very beautiful, like to be able to say, I translate this author because I feel connected to her. And that's also political, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the metaphors that we're collecting here. Translation is antidote, as a way of getting at the stickiness of real life, and the mushrooms of resistance that we that we seek to cultivate. Right. Um, so translation can be political. Translation can be decolonial. It can be an activist action, right? It's also often collaborative, and that's something that I think is not always discussed, but it's almost inevitably collaborative in to varying degrees. And it occurs to me that some of you have met the authors that you've translated, or the authors long ago passed away, and you're not able to consult with them. I know in my own practice, it makes a really big difference to be able to talk to someone and say, "What did you mean here? What's most important in this line?" And all kinds of other questions. And I know that, Lucia, to come back to you, you've been translating the poetry of Emily Yoon, who I believe you just met during Lit and Loose Festival last year. Could you say something about that process, how you came to work with her work, and what it was like to meet her for the first time? And
Yeah, it was a very touching experience because I don't know, I was very excited because with Lucille Clifton I just didn't have the chance to work with, obviously, but with Emily I think that it happened a little bit kind of like it did with Clifton, because Emily's poetry also plays a lot with sound and the proximity between words in their significance, and she has like this wordplay constantly. So with Clifton, for example, I had to like listen to a lot of audios of her reading out loud because there's a specific music to them, and I wanted to respect that. But with Emily, I could actually not just watch videos of her reading out loud, but I talk to her and listen to the poems in presence, and I think that makes, I don't know, a sort of different um, resonance in the translations. I made like a little like I made my first versions of the poems, and then I have been working on them since I met her, and it definitely changed. But also, I felt a little more free to make to play with my translation, because I felt like we were working as collaborators and not just like paying homage to a figure that I really admire, like Lucille Clifton. So it's different, and I think it allows more playing ground for the translation activity, and also intention, that it is sometimes part of the conversation you can have with a living author, intention in the work.
Anybody else want to share a thought about collaboration? Sophie.
I really love what Lucia was just saying. I think I always try and work with my authors. I bother them. I write, and I'd never work the same way with them. Sometimes, depending on the kind of connection that I would kind of have generated with them, sometimes they're friends of a friend, and things are a bit more friendly. Sometimes it's more formal. But yeah, just questions upon questions. And I do think that the quality of a translation is revealed in some way by the quality of one's doubts, the level of doubt, the level of possibility that every conundrum, that every choice has opened up to you, reveals the translator's task. And so Fernanda Melchor wrote to me once, because I was just kind of, it was near the end of the process, and I get more nervous towards the end about that I've got everything right. And so I was sending her kind of questions. She said, keep them coming. There are no stupid questions. No hay preguntas tontas. And I thought that pretty much sums it up for me. And I love what Lucia was saying about, one last thing, sorry, about trust. And I think that there's a kind of paradox. The closer you work with an author and ask them, the more space you have to creatively to you kind of start working symbiotically. If you know their intentions, if you've begun to understand what they were trying to achieve, you get tighter restrictions that you can just be much freer within. And you really can start deconstructing English in order to make it do what you need it to do.
I like the idea that added restrictions actually offer more freedom and more creative license in a way, more latitude. Yeah.
That reminded me of one of the translations that I've done collaboratively on two fronts, were with a friend of mine who's also a poet called Amaranth Borsuk. Maybe some of you have read her work. And we did translations of Paul Brafort, who's a Nulipo poet. And we did, because Ulipo has lots of rules and lots of, very particular instructions of what they're doing in their work, the layers and layers of sort of formal, but also, conceptual sort of frameworks are like puzzles to sort of work through. But then talking and discussing things with Paul, lots of other things would come up, not just in the work and in the translation, but beyond it. And sort of the conversations got richer, and those conversations which sometimes sort of meander to, things that seem off topic, actually, I feel, make those translations richer, more nuanced, better. Sometimes you go for, certain answers, other times you go for precision, other times for ambiguity, whatever the work requires. And if it's possible to have these conversations, I find they're enormously enriching, fun, interesting. And yeah, sometimes they start out very formal, like Sophie was saying, and then you end up as, as friends. And also sometimes they're your sort of peers in terms of age, but other times they're older authors who then, all these interesting things that have to do with collaboration, but like with what I said, like hospitality, start sort of happening with these, in the moment of collaborative translations. So I've never, I think, translated someone who is not alive, and I've always had the fortune of I've translated older authors, and we always end up being great friends. And, I feel like I'm very fortunate to have the opportunity to work with people who are very much outside my frame of reference suddenly. And that only enriches, obviously, the translation, but also just me as a translator, because we were saying, I think Lucia was saying, it's also a very personal affect, thing that becomes effective in terms of, like, it affects us personally and emotionally, etc. It's not like we're just these, UN, people who are just like, becomes your life's work. This is as much as work as writing a book. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would just quickly add to that too, that I think it's really important that we talk about the role of collaboration in translation in the same way that it's important that we would talk about it in any kind of art, because it helps us to sort of blur this idea of a strict binary between the original and the translation, or between this idea of like an individual genius where words are objective rather than subjective. And yeah, I would also, just to add that one of the best parts about collaborating with Lucia Estrada on Catabasis was that she really empowered me actually to make the English poems my own poems, or to make them poems in English first and foremost. And so she gave me a lot of freedom to go a little bit further away from the quote unquote literal translation.
Yeah, that definitely can be a freeing experience. I felt that working with Alejandro Alvaran, who's a Mexican poet, who I started translating because we were paired together in Lit and Loose, and we had the chance to get to know each other that way. I wouldn't have found his work otherwise. And to be able to sit down with him and ask him questions and have him say to me, the sound play here is absolutely crucial. It's absolutely paramount. Stay within the semantic field, but have at it. Changes the way that you come at the translation process, right? I really appreciate what you said, Olivia, too, about how this is several of you have said this, it's a kind of writing, it's a creative process. It's not a matter of simply channeling it, as you were, I think, implying, Gabriela, as a UN interpreter, just kind of allowing the language to go through you. We do that, but then we do things to it. So, Gabi, could I also ask you a follow-up question, since you've also been in the position of translating yourself? I'm really curious to know what that process has been like for you, how you came to decide to do that, what it was like to go through it. Would you do it again? What were some of the challenges and exciting things about it?
It's weird. I've actually now, I feel like I've only done it very few times, and I am now increasingly disinclined to do it because of the collaborative process. It's so much more fun to work with someone on this, like, language puzzle than it is to just work with yourself. I mean, obviously, if like, I'd rather, for example, if whenever possible, I'd rather just write straight up in English. Like, my first poetry book was written in English, not in Spanish, then translated by myself into English. Or if I'm writing something in Spanish, I'd rather have someone work with me as a translator, because it's it can be a weird puzzle to solve by yourself. It's like, I don't know, maybe some people enjoy playing solitary. I'm not a huge solitary player. So I'd rather collaborate and do that rather than translate myself, or I just straight up write in one language or the other without having to sit. So I've only done it a few times where I've written, let's say, in Spanish and then translated it to English. Or vice versa, from English and translated to Spanish. And it's weird.
Gabby, you're echoing a Beckett quote that I always think about when he used to, because we always hold him up as this kind of a paragon of like self-translator as genius, and he called it the wastes and wilds of self-translation. He hated it.
Yes, and it's also, I feel like it's somehow closing your work as opposed to opening it up somehow.
That's so interesting.
That's fascinating. Have any of the others translated themselves before? Yeah. Well, when you talk about translating as solving a puzzle, either in an Oulipian sense or in the sense of solving a puzzle that maybe you've created for yourself through your own work that you're translating, right? I'd be interested to hear of any puzzles that the four of you have encountered, that you've had to devise solutions for, any particular challenges or sticky moments that might have been frustrating or surprising, and how you worked around them.
Well, I'll just jump in really quick. The Oulipo example was a perfect example of this, multi-layered puzzle. It was like a 3D puzzle. And so what we decided to do was all the things that were being left over in a certain solution of that puzzle, let's say we had to keep the rhymes, and therefore some of the layered meanings were, we had to choose one over the other so we could have a word that rhymes with, in the pattern that it had to rhyme or whatever. Then we kept making these sort of side poems, and we called them transversions. So they were like perverted translations, or trans versions, really, like tranny versions of our text. And so that's what we ended up writing those as a third option. And so they were all the sort of leftover, sort of useless things that people throw out in translations, which if you're translating a novel, it would be like the shadow, I don't know, like writing a whole shadow novel. In poetry, it's much easier. And it was very fun. So we ended up doing this triptych. So you'd have the French, then the English, and then the transversion.
That's fantastic. I love it. I love this triptych. You make it sound like a sort of runoff from the poetic translation process, and yet it sounds to me just as lively, perhaps, and dynamic as the otother versions.
It's beautiful. It's like George Steiner's My Unwritten Books, but there with the books. So, it's great.
Yep, exactly. if you're interested, I'm involved with a creative translation group called Utranspo. So we're like the Ulipo, but it's a collective of international translators. We've been doing this for about 8 years now, and we're across several continents. We work in a range of languages. But on our website, utranspo.com, we have a series of constraints for creative translation, which is doing pretty much exactly what you just described to create new text through the process of translating. So that's a lot of fun. Yeah. So I think in just a couple minutes, we're going to transition to taking any questions from the audience. But if there's any other examples of exciting challenges that you've met or encountered in the process of translation and the wastes and wilds of translating yourself and others that you'd like to share, it's a little bit abstract, of course, to talk about something without having text in front of us. But if anything else leaps to mind, and I would say, Olivia, I really appreciate your translation of Sound Play from Lucia Estrada. From Spanish into English. That's really challenging. And I noticed it when I was reading the book.
Thank you. Yeah, I also have to give a big shout out to Michei Montero, that my editor at Eulalia Books, who really helped me to draw that out even more in the translation. But that is one thing I was going to bring up, is just that Catabus is a book that exists sort of in this ambiguous space. It's not a very grounded or concrete space. And so much of the way that the book means is sort of beyond the linguistic or beyond like these particular markers of meaning. And so one of the things that I tried to do with the translation was I really tried to channel the intertextuality of the book. So this is a very intertextual book. There's a ton of epigraphs. There's a ton of poems that are written in either explicit dialogue or non-explicit dialogue with other authors. And a quick example would be that Sylvia Plath is a main interlocutor of the book. An epigraph of hers opens it, and then there's also a poem written to her. And so one of the things I did was I read Ariel in English, and I tried to, whenever I could, channel some of Plath's English into the Spanish. And one of the ways that happened was that in the epigraph that Lucia Estrada opens the book with, in Spanish, it's temblor de aire. But in Plath's English, it's an air stir. And so I tried to use these sort of clipped nouns whenever I could, because they're not as syntactically possible in the Spanish. So I looked for moments where the Spanish was using this kind of construction and where I could use this kind of Plath-like English. And so a couple examples where sílaba de aire, air syllable, vueltas de llave, key turns, dolor de sal, salt ache. And so really focusing on the intertextuality was actually a way where I could find these moments in the text where they didn't stand out to me at first, but then I could find moments that were really calling on me to be more creative and take more risks with the translation.
That's fantastic. I love that you went back to the Plath to kind of feed it through, to weave it into the English.
It's like Plath became your, collaborator from El Más Allá, your Ouija collaborator. I love it.
Yeah, well, totally. And that's, that's that whole thing about collaboration too, is also just thinking of influences, right? That none of the original words that are being chosen are being just sort of like pulled out of this individual genius, but a network. And so being able to think about that in the translation too.
Yes, translation as a network, translation as an act of hospitality. Yeah. Well, let's see. I think we've got some questions from the audience. So let me relay one here. This comes from Sarah Carminati, and she asks, I'm curious how each of you first got started working as literary translators. What was it that resonated about this singular mode of literary production for you? Anybody want to take a jump on that? How you got started? Sophie, you want to?
I'm happy to. Yeah, that's fine. I may be, but correct me if I'm wrong, the only one on the panel who's now like a full-time literary translator. I obviously do things around that, like read reader reports for publishers and stuff like that. But my almost sole income is through translation or talking about translation. And I began on the more publishing side of things. So I did a master's in comparative literature with translation studies. I was very interested, and then we were in the middle of a financial crisis, and I just needed a job. So I started working at a literary agency. So I kind of threw myself into the much more mercenary side of what we all work with, contracts and rights and things like that. But that was actually life-saving. So if anyone is listening to this conversation and is interested in becoming a literary translator, I have to say that having seen both sides of the coin, it's been fantastically useful for me to understand that they are also products books, and that rights, it's very important before you kind of absolutely give your heart away to a text and start translating it, to make sure that the rights are available, that this is a book that you're going to be able to follow through on. Things like that, that maybe seem simple to me now that I'm kind of 10 years into it. But looking back, yeah, I think it was really vital to understand how you are even able to pitch to a publisher, or how you can even get started. There are really loads and loads of online resources for anyone who is listening and is interested in that. Pen, like America, or English Pen, anyone in the UK. I'm obviously British. Kind of finding your feet in America was another whole other kind of minefield, really, of kind of becoming someone that someone would hire. Not least because we have speak different Englishes, and it takes some convincing to convince. Sadly, it's the Americans who are tougher to convince that American readers are not so stupid that they cannot understand British English, or a kind of more neutral English. It's getting better, but it still happens. But yeah, no, I basically read a book. I was doing all of this kind of more publishing stuff, and then I realized that I read a book, and it was in Spanish, and I knew that I wanted to tell everyone about this book. And so I wrote to the agent and kind of did the literary agent kind of thing, but backwards, and wrote to the agent and said, is there a sample? How can I get involved? And so I did do a sample, and it got bought. And luckily that was kind of nearly not one of my first translations, but one of my first attempts to get published. And that happened. So yeah, it was this kind of combination of the more practical side of things, but really having a kind of like whimsical need to get back to the text and the page. And I found my way back.
Yeah, I actually started studying translation as an undergraduate student at Kenyon College. I was lucky enough to have Catherine Hedin as my professor, and she taught a literary translation seminar in Spanish. And so actually when I look back on it, my sort of coming into intellectual consciousness coincided with discovering literary translation and reading translation theory. That was the first literary theory I'd ever read, and really starting to think about these ideas. And then I would just say that the translation community is so generous, and it's been I've felt so supportive as an emerging translator. And Rachel's one of those people too that I met when I was first working, and has been so generous and supportive. And so that's really the next step too, is just to reach out to people and to talk with them and ask them to read your work, and establish a community that way.
Yeah, I think Olivia's experience resonates with me also, because I also started studying literary translation as an undergraduate student at UNAM. Actually, I get to assist to a workshop in poetry translation specifically, and I just fell in love with the exercise and this puzzle Gabby mentioned. I don't know, it was so exciting for me, because I also was searching for a creative space within academic work, and it was very funny how literary translation was for me like middle ground for it, like a space where I could kind of go back and forth between literary studies and my own creative writing. And also it made me more confident in my own literary searchings and stuff. But then I think I reached out to some of my professors at UNAM, and I showed them my literary work, literary translation work, and I felt really supported by them. And I think it's a very generous community, as you said. And also in my master's degree, my classmates were all very collaborative. We have like a very broad sense of community and reading and sharing the text, maybe because there's not this idea of authorship as a single unity,
looking for the unmute. For me, it started almost sort of, I was always already in translation. Like I was that person who would always, if I was at a like get together and someone from abroad was in Mexico and couldn't speak Spanish and the others didn't speak English, I was always like the interpreter. And vice versa, when I moved to the States and I was living there, the same thing happened the other way around. If someone like a relative or friend was visiting and didn't speak English, then I would always be the. So it started off as like as basic as like, what do you want to order? Oh yes, no, we're talking about this, or like, so that's how I started translation. It was a very, very sort of low level translation to everyday kind of interaction translation since I was a kid, basically. And so from that, this back and forth was always there, but the actual sort of interest in this kind of translation, not just interpreting for people, but the seed is there. That is the seed. Was, I think, also as an undergrad and doing more sort of creative writing sort of workshops, and within that doing these sort of writing through exercises that have to do with sort of creative, sort of trippy translation, and sort of realizing, I think those were my first exercises in translation, and realizing obviously the emphasis there was the sort of creative potential of it for your own work. But in doing that, it sort of opened all the possibilities of what that means, not just for your own work, but for other people's work. And also, again, having always lived in translation, I think it also stemmed from a lot of frustration in reading Spanish from Spain translations, which in Mexico is what you get a lot of. And there are those, it's not that we don't understand them. We are force-fed those translations. I don't know, Lucia, if this happened to you. And sometimes they're very frustrating to read. I don't know, let's say Jamaican, I'm just making this up, but like, let's say Jamaica Kincaid, and suddenly she's saying things like gilipollas, like a very particular Spanish from Spain type and it's like, there's no universe in which that would happen except in this weird universe of those peculiar translations, right? And so it was also a sort of need to read amazing books that are translated into more Latin American Spanish, like in the airplane when people used to travel in airplanes, there would be like that Spanish option and then Latin option, whatever that means, which was Spanish from Latin America, which is always so silly. But at the same time, yeah, when I was a teenager, I didn't want to read certain things. There was a resistance to reading certain things in this very stiff academic, from Academia Real Spanish, that was like, why? Or yeah, John Berger, who's like talking about borders and migration, and suddenly it became this very sort of Eurocentric way of having to read certain texts that were questioning those sorts of things. So it was also a sort of, yeah, sort of the punk, somehow like punk do it yourself, like, okay, we'll fudge it, let's do it,
Thank you for sharing this. This is totally fascinating. And we have another question that's been posed. It's a topic maybe some of us have thought about in the past. Is anything impossible to translate? Are there certain texts that are impossible to translate, or certain elements or facets or variables in text that are impossible to translate? This is from someone who's watching right now. Anybody want to address that?
I think it's impossible to translate poetry, but that's just not to do it, but I can't do it, as in, sorry, not impossible. We mustn't stop translating poetry. I find it really hard to translate poetry, and it's because I feel I've never done it where I haven't felt that I'm separating the inseparable. But all it means is more compromises and a kind of letting yourself go into more of the right, like falling a bit further into the writer, you know, the poet figure rather than the translator figure, like what you were saying, Lucia, about like being given the space to like just to have a bit more authority with the text that you're working into, and Olivia, you were saying something similar, yeah, being almost like being allowed to, being given permission to, and I just have never given myself that permission because prose. I love poetry. I read it a lot, but maybe I love it too much to butcher it. So I find that really impossible.
Yeah, I just think things may be impossible to translate depending on how we're defining translation, but nothing's impossible to transcreate. And so some things require more creativity or a few different attempts, maybe, but I don't like to think of anything as being impossible.
Yeah, I think I don't know, like when I have translated poetry, I always get this sense of I am betraying certain things in the text, but I also try to think that I am working with my own subjectivity and just making space for that. And I don't know, I think maybe it is impossible or very difficult, but I think it's very interesting that we keep on doing it. And why is that, right? It's an impulse, I think, to share, and I don't know, like to open and amplify an author's work. And I don't know, like maybe we're just very stubborn people, but yeah, I think there are impossible things to translate. I was thinking in Lucille Clifton's book Good Times, there were like these very culturally charged words that are like really offensive and have a really violent historical background, and there was not a way that I could translate that into Spanish, especially because our Afro communities have a totally different history and linguistic um, development. And I don't know, like it was really hard. I had the academic format of the dissertation, so I could maybe speak a little bit on a comment or on a translator's note, but I don't know how that would work like in a more literary edition for a reader that is not familiarized with Lucille Clifton. So yeah, I think maybe there are some things impossible to translate.
Well, Robert Frost famously said poetry gets lost in translation, but I believe that Octavio Paz said poetry is what's found in translation. And it seems to me that that's what several of us are getting at, is this idea that it can also be an opportunity for creativity, that having something really challenging to translate means that you have to be extra resourceful to come up with something that would correlate or somehow call back to the first text when you're making the second text. See how I didn't say original? And yeah. So, well, we have unfortunately reached the end of our time quite nearly. This is fantastic. I could talk with you for hours. I'd like to keep you here. This has been really rich, and I love thinking about translation as an act of radical hospitality, and also maybe an antidote to so many things, so many kinds of information that we're being pummeled with constantly. So I want to say a real heartfelt thank you to Sophie Hughes and Olivia Lott and Lucía Cornejo and Gabriela Jauregui for being here with us today, and for sharing your thoughts and your experiences about translation. We have more events this week. This is Lit and Loose Week, so do check out the schedule at litloose.org, which is on the screen, and you can register for the events that are coming up. Definitely don't miss the finale, the Lit and Loose live show, which will take place Friday, October 9th at 7 o'clock. It'll be hosted by Jose Olivares from here in Chicago and Jimena Gonzalez in Mexico. And it features collaborative work from nearly 24 Lit and Loose alums. And some fresh work and all kinds of things. So put it on your calendars and make sure to be there. The festival would not be possible without our partners, including the National Endowment for the Arts and the Illinois Humanities, as well as the MacArthur Funds for the Arts and Culture and at the Richard H. Driehaus Foundation, the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation, the Illinois Arts Council Agency, and the generosity of individual supporters. So all of this year's programming is free to enjoy. If you would like to show your support with a donation, there's a link to give below. And please help us spread the word, tell friends and family about the events, and we hope to see you more this week. Thank you again. Thanks for being here. Take care. Ciao.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.